Welcome back to another small bore and more. Today we've got a nice bit of kit from Sex Machine Racing to go on the bike. It's their machined alloy triple clamp. And with the mods we've done so far, perhaps this is one of the last things that jumps out as being really stock and kind of built to a price point. Now, Si, you've already fitted the black version of this on your bike. What's your thoughts?
Well, for me, it's my favourite mod so far. It's something you're seeing all the time when you're riding, and this thing absolutely oozes quality.
Right, let's get it unboxed, have a close look at the quality, and then show you how we get it swapped over onto this bike. If that's something you want to see, keep watching.
So to do the triple clamp modification today, we've opted to use the ABBA stand. The ABBA stand's a great bit of kit. What it's going to allow us to do is to cantilever the bike up so we can take the full front end off and not worry about anything else getting in the way. There's a couple of other different ways you'll be able to do it, but we're not going to say what you should and shouldn't do. For us, we've opted for the ABBA stand. Now you can get with the ABBA stand what's called a super bike adapter, which will get away from you having to ratchet the back wheel down. We've opted to ratchet the back wheel down because we haven't got the super bike stand, but it'll do exactly the same job. So the next thing to do is we're going to undo a couple of the tighter bolts, the front wheel spindle and the caliper bolts, just so that we're not putting unnecessary pressure on the back wheel strap.
So as you can see, we have a microfiber cloth under the ratchet strap, and we're just pulling down on the rear wheel to make it pivot on the ABBA stand, and we'll lift the whole front end of the bike off the ground. So you don't have to do this, but we're going to whip the seat and the tank off just so it's out of the way. There's no chance you can hit it, dent it, scratch it. It's just easy with it out of the way, and it doesn't take a lot of getting off. Then seat removal process is straightforward. Simply remove the two bolts, for which you can either use a 12mm socket or a 6mm Allen key. The tank's only held on by one fixing at the back of the tank, but you have to unplug the electrical connection for the fuel pump, the fuel line itself, and two breather tubes on the underside. But once that's all disconnected, just work the tank backwards off the two rubber mounts at the front and it'll come away. Love the smell of petrol. Okay, next, because this bike has the big Brembo brake upgrade kit, you have to whip the pads out to remove the caliper, which then lets us pull the axle out using the blue Driven Racing pull cups. Set the wheel aside. With the wheel off, remove the fork guards and the Nemoto carbon front fender, which is just two bolts either side. Something else you might want to do is just take the weight of the caliper by suspending it with a bungee or similar off the bars, and it's not hanging on the brake hose. Removing the front forks is really simple. It's just 3 bolts each side, lower them down out of the triple clamp. But you want to be sure that you've got the weight of them before undoing the bolts, as they'll just fall straight through. With the forks out, you can get a good look at the OEM triple clamp. The next thing we need to do is take the bars off, and this means removing the 4 Allen bolts and the clamp itself. You'll notice that we've now got ratchet straps around the bars so we can suspend them up slightly out of the way, which just makes working on the triple clamp that little bit easier. Once that's done, we need to unplug the ignition module unit, which means taking the headlight out for access. But once you have the access, it's just one multi-plug to disconnect and feed it through the cowl. The dash bracket's also connected to the top yoke, so that needs to be unscrewed and just laid down. Now the stem nut's a bit of an odd size, and we didn't have the correct 29mm socket. Apparently that's not a common size, so we ended up using an adjustable spanner. Not ideal, but it got the job done. And it's on pretty tight, so it's definitely a 2-person job. The access is a bit tight, so if you do have a 29mm socket, it'll be a lot easier. Once that's off, just wiggle the top yoke up and off, taking the ignition unit with it. Now you've obviously got to transfer the ignition unit, and for obvious reasons that's attached with anti-tamper fittings, so we'll get into that in a minute. To get the stem out, we need to remove the castle nut. Again, there's a tool you can buy for these and they're not expensive, but we don't have one to hand, so we're using a soft brass punch just to tap it round. They're not on tight, this really just keeps the bearings in place. Once that's off, we just lower the bottom clamp and the stem out of the head of the bike. Plus, we'll remove the top head bearing race too. We'll be reusing these later, so put them somewhere safe. You don't want any grit or dirt getting on them. Now to the awkward bit. If you're lucky, you might be able to jam an Allen key, a Torx or Easy Out into the anti-tamper bit fittings. But if, like us, that doesn't work for you, then your only real option is to drill the head of the fitting. We went up in 1mm steps to 12mm, but be careful because at 12mm there's not a lot of clearance between the drill bit and the edge of the ignition module. You don't want to catch the edge of the module. When you're done drilling, you're left with two studs. We just remove them with a small pair of Stilsons. Okay, let's get the triple clamp unboxed and have a close look. Nice quality SMR sticker, some instructions, and look at that. So right away you can see there's a lot of time and effort gone into machining these parts. The top yoke looks beautiful. Bar clamps have SMR machined into them. And that's a lovely top nut. We'll have to be careful not to mark that later. The bottom clamp and stem feel really light, and we'll get some weight comparisons for you later on. And I love how it has Sex Machine Racing engraved into it. It's a shame that's going to be hidden. So side by side you can see just how much more bling and attention to detail there is over the OEM yoke. Plus a lot more clamping area to hold the forks rigid. First thing we need to do is mount the bar clamps, but before tightening them up fully, top tip, offer them up to the bars, make sure you get them 100% aligned. Tighten them up from the bottom, this ensures the clamps are perfectly aligned to the bars when you come to attach them later. So rather than try and remove the bearing seat from the old clamp, we've opted to just buy 3 replacement parts: the bottom washer, the rubber seal and the lower bearing seat. The bearing seat's an interference fit, and although with a bit of heat and persuasion we'd probably get it off, for the price of them we'll just use new components. I'll put the part numbers in the description too. The seal sits in between the washer and around the bearing seat. You can see the bearing seat part number on screen. So these go together like this. However, we're going to have to heat the bearing seat up so it expands to overcome the interference fit. Place it in position, and when it cools down it'll contract and it'll be secured in position. Obviously we can't heat it up with the rubber seal in place, so we'll get it into position first and work the rubber seal over it and into position once it's cooled down. So we're heating it up with a magnetic induction heater. It's going to make it very hot, heat it evenly and very quickly, and it'll just slide down perfectly into position. And once it's cooled down, we need to add some grease to the seal and just work it into position. Then add plenty of grease to the bearing race itself. As we said before, we'll get some weights on screen, and you can see that the SMR is 429 grams lighter, so it's a decent weight saving. Next step is to add the ignition unit to the top yoke, which is held in place with 2 Allen bolts. We're using medium or blue Loctite just to make sure they don't vibrate out. You could use anti-tamper fittings, but in reality these bikes are so small, if someone wanted to take them they'd just pick them up, put them in the back of a van and away. Before putting the stem into the head, make sure you've plenty of grease in there. Then offer the stem up through the head of the bike. Then again, more lithium grease for the top set. Bearing on first, and then bearing seat, then the castle nut. Like before, if you have the correct tool, great. If not, tap it round with a non-marking punch It's literally just over hand tight. It's just to make sure the bearings are pulled nicely together. You do not want to be over tightening this, putting unnecessary pressure on those ball bearings. Once you're happy with that, it's time for the top yoke to go on, and that's secured in place with the top nut. Make sure the little frame that holds all the wiring and the headlight brackets is seated correctly in between the holes in the top and bottom of the triple clamps. At this point, it's a good time to reconnect the ignition wires and reconnect the dash. Now it's time to get the forks back in, and they just slide up into the clamps, making sure they're exactly the same length through. Now only tighten the lower pinch bolts lightly for now. Like we mentioned before, it's best to protect the top yoke and the nut before tightening, so we're just using blue masking tape, and that worked pretty well. Once that's tight, we can tighten the top pinch bolts and then torque them all to 27 Newton meters. You'll have to revisit the pair of pinch bolts in the lower clamp. When you tighten one, it releases pressure on the other, so just go back and forth till bolts don't move before hitting the correct torque, and you'll be good to go. Fit the bars and evenly tighten the clamps down, making sure you've got them evenly positioned on the indicator marks. Then it's refitting the front wheel, lowering the front end back down, torquing the axle up to 59 Newton meters. Refit the fender and fork guards, refit the caliper and the pads, sort the cables out, torque everything back up, caliper bolts being 30 Newton meters. Then it's tank and seat back on, and we're done. The last thing to do is take it off the aber stand, stick it back on the paddock stand, job done. That's the SMR triple clamp fitted. A few challenges along the way, so I hope you found the video useful. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It'll help us make more content like this. Now, as far as the triple clamp itself, the finish and the machining is lovely. It's typical sex machine racing. And nearly half a kilo lighter, that's never a bad thing. I can't wait for the engine casings to be ready for the JB03.
As I've mentioned earlier, I've got this fitted in black on the 2023 Monkey, and I've just got to say the aluminium bare finish is just as nice.
You can get the black and bare versions from Ben's Bike Racing, and we'll put a link below so you can track them down yourself. For now, that's all from Small Board and More, so we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.